Well, let's get to our panel. Joining us now for more, Dan Arbell is a scholar in residence for the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Omar Baddar is Deputy Director of the Arab American Institute. And Cammack is a fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks to all of you for being here, all of us in the studio. Perry, let me start with you. And let's look at the statement that President Trump has made. And I just want to go back to something that took place in the 90s, and that was the passing of the Jerusalem Embassy Act, passed in 1995. That was a law passed by Congress. There was bipartisan support for that law, and it recognized Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. But that law also makes provisions for presidents to postpone any action, actually taking action on that law, like relocating the embassy, as we heard today. That was called a waiver. So what's new today?
Well, certainly what's new is that the president, even though he made the decision to sign the waiver, essentially endorsed the concept or the spirit of the law there, which his three predecessors, Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, representing two different parties, of course, did not do, basically saying the U.S. will withhold recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel until such time as there is a two-state solution. Now, from my perspective, I think what's happening is that the president seems very keen to make waves, to make splash. So just as we saw with his decision to pull out of the Paris Protocol, just as we saw with his decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear negotiation, there's a big symbolic gesture, but then when we get to the kind of substance of what's actually changed, I think as your correspondents put it well, I think there the issue is a little murkier. So, you know, I think we're very likely to see a kind of immediate reaction on the streets, certainly in the West Bank, probably in Jordan. I think hopefully we'll get through that phase with relatively little or no bloodshed. The question is, where does this take the peace process, quote unquote, going forward? And I think we won't know that for some time.
Because, Perry, we're hearing a lot of words, and as you say, if we don't see any action, it amounts to naught, but it does inflame tensions, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see this really as a symbolic gesture. I personally think it was a mistake. I think it was unnecessary and counterproductive, both in terms of the so-called peace process, but also in terms of the U.S. ability to act as a mediator in the Middle East. But in terms of the long-term implications, I think it will be some time until we really know that.
Dan, for Israel, I mean, if we look at Jerusalem, in practical terms, Jerusalem is already the capital of Israel. It's the seat of government, it's the seat of parliament, the Knesset, the seat of the prime minister's office is there, so is the president's office. So what does recognition mean for Israel?
So I think that recognition for Israel is very symbolic. In the Israeli perspective, it's correcting a wrong, a historic wrong. The state was established in 1948 and set, at the time, its capital in Jerusalem, and moved all the government institutions, as you said, also the Supreme Court, and the judicial, executive, and legislative branches. And Jerusalem was, for all points and purposes, the capital. So in that sense, it doesn't change anything on the ground in Israel tomorrow morning, because Jerusalem is the capital of Israel in the view of many Israelis. What it does do, it gives sort of a legitimacy, an international legitimacy by the world's greatest superpower to the fact that Jerusalem is very much the capital city of Israel.
Omar, how do the Palestinians respond to this? Because they want Jerusalem to be the capital of a Palestinian state when that is created.
There's absolutely crucial context here that we cannot overlook. East Jerusalem is illegally annexed Palestinian territory that Israel took over to the condemnation of the entire world, including the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and actively on the ground in East Jerusalem. Israel is carrying out home demolitions of Palestinians, pushing Palestinians out of their homes and allowing some settlers to take over those homes. So in essence, Israel is denying Palestinian rights to Jerusalem. So when Congress calls for recognition of Jerusalem as an undivided capital, at a time when Israel has illegally annexed East Jerusalem, I think that was basically pandering for domestic purposes, and every U.S. president was absolutely right in taking the national security waiver on this. Frankly, the law should not have been passed at all to begin with, and it only makes sense that if Israel wants to have Jerusalem recognized as a capital, all you have to do is end the occupation of the Palestinian half, and then you can declare it as a capital. But what Trump needed to do, in order to make this sensible, he needed to come out and say, okay, fine, we acknowledge that Israel is the capital, that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but also is the capital of Palestinians, and we condemn and we're going to take direct actions to try to stop Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem and demand a withdrawal from that. Only in that context would it have been a fair and even-handed thing to do.
But he did seem to want to have it both ways, didn't he? Because on the one hand, he says, look, this is the capital. On the other hand, he did say, I'm not making any decisions on what the final borders of a Palestinian state will be like or the status of Jerusalem. So he's saying, I've done this, but all the other things are still open.
Except it was done in a way that is incredibly provocative. If you listen to his speech, I mean, it's filled with logical contradictions and logical fallacies. And it was done at a time when what you really need, I mean, the reason why peace was not achieved is because there was never meaningful pressure on Israel to end the occupation and stop settlement expansion. There was tepid criticism, but US military support and diplomatic cover continued unabated. And every time the Palestinians tried to go to the UN, these were described as unilateral moves that were condemned and punished, while Israel was allowed to build settlements without any negotiations. In this particular context, when what you need is actually additional pressure on Israel to achieve a peaceful agreement, to effectively endorse this undivided Jerusalem, is essentially rewarding Israeli bad behavior and therefore making peace actually more and more difficult.
Okay, I want to get Dan's response to that in a moment. First, Perry, let me go to you. The president did say in his announcement today that what he's doing is going to advance the cause of peace in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This is a key issue, the status of Jerusalem. It's one of the so-called final status issues. Is it going to advance the cause of peace?
Well, it's hard for me to see how it advances the cause of peace. You know, I think we'll see what the actual reaction is on the ground. It's too early to see that. I'm struck that this was a big chit in a complicated negotiations, and the so-called greatest negotiator in the world essentially gave it to Israel for free. Now, I think it's possible that this is a kind of recognition that there now is understanding in the White House that the Trump initiative actually isn't going anywhere. And so rather than kind of admit defeat, there's an attempt to kind of push the boundaries of U.S. policy in a way which I personally disagree with, but clearly many Republicans and Democrats in Congress are supportive of. But the idea that this advances the cause of peace, you know, I don't think holds water, although it's not exactly the case that we are on the cusp of success anyway.
Dan, a few things here. One, did Israel get something for free on the one hand? On the other, as Omar pointed out, is the United States rewarding bad behavior?
So I think, first of all, as I've said, I was born and raised in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is my hometown. I think the decision by the president today does correct a historic wrong. I myself don't represent the government, but I do question the timing of this decision. And I do agree with Omar that it should have been packaged in a way, in a broader context. You give Israel something, you give the Palestinians something. So Trump did leave the door open in a way by uttering for the first time the words two-state solution, also by caveating it with a, if the parties agree. He also emphasized time and time again the fact that it does not predetermine future outcome of future negotiations or future borders or anything. The fact that my colleagues here are talking about the entirety of Jerusalem, he didn't speak about a geographical Jerusalem. He just said the word Jerusalem. It's in East Jerusalem or West Jerusalem. It left it open to interpretations. Basically, I think that, to your second question, I don't think Israel got it for free, but I do think that it should have been done in a more in a broader context, in a different kind of package, allowing both parties face-saving measures in order to really start a process. Because as Perry said, there is no process to undermine because there is no process, simply.
But the thing is that, you know, if this is a symbolic gesture, if he didn't really talk about physical Jerusalem and the borders that are going to be seen there, what's the point of making this statement? Because as we heard from our reporter, we have Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader, now saying, we are never going to see the United States as an honest broker anymore.
It's hard to get into the head, the mind of what's going on through the president's mind, especially with Donald Trump. But I think that first of all, he said that he's delivering on a campaign promise. This is something that he promises. Finally, he's delivering on it 1 year later. Second, as Omar said, this is domestic considerations, playing to his political base, trying to evangelical Christians and others who are very much in support of this move and trying to play along with their concerns and solidify his base. So, and I don't know how much this has to do with actually the realities in the Middle East on the ground.
Omar, can President Abbas go into any future peace process with any credibility at this stage?
I simply don't think so. And frankly, it's even before this move. I mean, the U.S. was never an honest broker for peace during this entire peace process. I mean, as we pointed out, the peace process failed for a very specific reason. The whole concept of a two-state solution was the Palestinians recognized Israel as they did in 1988. And what was supposed to happen in response is a gradual Israeli withdrawal from the Palestinian territories. And what we saw was the exact opposite, is a continued Israeli expansion throughout those Palestinian territories that continues to this day. The settlements are still expanding as we speak. And repeatedly, you have Netanyahu saying that there will not be a Palestinian state on his watch, that there will not be a return to the 1967 borders. And in light of this type of rhetoric, the peace process was already dead to begin with. And so for the U.S. to not just not criticize or harshly condemn or work against Israeli policies in the Palestinian territories, but to go as far as to effectively endorse Israel's capture of East Jerusalem, which, by the way, I know that he did not define the boundaries, but he is responding to the congressional law, which basically references Israel's capture of Jerusalem in '67 and says it must be undivided. So in that particular framing, he is effectively endorsing Israel's capture of all of Jerusalem. And so there is no peace process to speak of. I mean, the U.S. was not credible as a neutral mediator and now cannot be a mediator altogether under these circumstances.
Perry, one other way of looking at this is what incentive is there now for the Israelis to negotiate, to go through this process of give and take, to compromise? Because essentially, Benjamin Netanyahu has got what he wants thanks to the largesse of the American leader.
Well, I think in some ways you answered your own question, Anon, and that's why I say, you know, it is a little strange for the kind of, you know, world's greatest negotiator to kind of give the ultimate prize before the negotiations have actually started, which leads me to believe actually that they came themselves to understand, their own rhetoric notwithstanding, that the pieces are simply not in place for a serious negotiations at this time.
If I can add just one small thing to this as well. You know, Trump kept referencing the idea that maybe in the future there could be a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem if the parties agree to it. I mean, this idea of leaving the parties to figure this out on their own is never going to work. There is such an imbalance of power that if you leave the parties for their, you know, to figure this out on their own, what you're going to see is an imposition of Israeli will on Palestinians consistently. What you need is you have to have American leadership and American pressure. At this point, we don't see it coming in a positive directions, but you do need external pressure to try to resolve this issue because the parties, you know, there isn't a balance of power that can have this work out on its own.
Dan, if Prime Minister Netanyahu is sitting there in Jerusalem in his office with his cabinet and they look at the list of priorities for Israel, how high up that list of priorities is finding peace with the Palestinians today?
I think not very high on his agenda. First of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu sees this as a great diplomatic achievement for him, and it also takes away some of the pressure that he's feeling in public opinion over his criminal investigations and so on and so forth. But as he looks at the region and looks at the situation as a whole, I think Iran is very much on his mind, the situation in Syria, possible spillover, the strengthening of Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south. And the Palestinians figure into that equation in some way, but I don't think he sees as a top priority. Having said that, Trump now, and experts on Trump are saying that Israel should be careful for what it wishes for, because now Trump has given Israel, has thrown that chip away to Israel. Then the next step would be, according to a real estate broker, would be giving a chip to the other side. So we have to see how Trump plays this game, if he plays it in a kind of a even-handed way. We'll have to see. We don't have the crystal ball, but it may end up that Israel will not be that thrilled in the future when Trump comes up with a different kind of chip to throw to the Palestinians.
Yeah, I want to get to that point about the larger Middle East peace process. You know, what has Trump got up his sleeve? But Omar, let me ask you about this and President Abbas. Is it time for him to throw in the towel? Because if he looks at the situation right now, does he see a situation where the mediator has basically got a finger on the scale here?
I definitely think the towel should have been thrown in a long time ago. I mean, the policy should be pretty straightforward. The only expression of, I mean, I don't even know if the two-state solution is alive at this point, whether it can be brought back. I mean, there cannot be even a negotiation in that direction to begin with, unless there's an immediate and complete and total halt to Israeli settlements, and we have not seen that at all. So I really don't see what future there is for any kind of peace process. If I had to speculate about what the future is at this point, there's going to be a few rounds of violence separated by periods of peace, and during those periods of peace, there's going to be continued Israeli takeover of the Palestinian territories, and this may eventually just become a struggle for a single democratic state with equality for all. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we're really looking at effectively conflict for decades to come. It really, as depressing as that sounds, I don't know what roadmap there could be as a way out of that.
Perry, today's announcement, was that a major step towards the end of a two-state solution?
In a sense, it could. I agree with both the panelists, my colleagues here, that I think, you know, if you're going to write the obituary of the two-state solution, I don't think today was you would date it today. This is kind of a postscript, I think, to what had already been a moribund process for a long time. On the other hand, life goes on, and the conflict will go on. And I think, to me, a really interesting question, as Omar alluded to, is what is the future of the Palestinian national movement, which has, at least in Ramallah, kind of been pretty adamant in kind of a nonviolent, diplomatic two-state outcome. The question is, if that pathway is no longer viable, what becomes of this movement, and what is the objective? Is it one state? Is it return to violence? Is it something else? And I think we just don't know the answer to that question.
And frankly, you could see diminishing support for the Palestinian Authority significantly. Effectively, what their function right now is an employer in the Palestinian territories for a significant portion of the population, and effectively a security subcontractor for Israel. You know, they make sure that there are no acts of violence that are taking place. But in the long term, you're going to have to offer something better to the Palestinians if you're going to be viewed as a legitimate leadership. And unfortunately, between Trump and Netanyahu, they're not giving them any space to assert themselves as a legitimate leadership.
Dan, do you detect any kind of major, big, grand plan here on the part of Trump, some strategic plan, of which this is only a small part that we heard today, to bring peace to the Middle East?
Well, I think that he's still, and you heard it today, he spoke about a new approach several times, and he alluded to a so-called plan, Middle East peace plan that he has. And we know that his son-in-law, his senior advisor, Jared Kushner, has been in the region several times, and Jason Greenblatt, who's a special envoy of the administration. And they're working with the sides. They've been in a listening mode for many months now, but last weekend, we've heard Jared Kushner state that, you know, they're about to roll out a broad plan. And they've been talking to the Saudis and to other Gulf countries, to Jordan and Egypt, of course, to Israel and the Palestinians. So I think the hope that Trump has is to still, despite today's announcement, to forge ahead and to offer a plan to the parties and try to promote it.
Perry, domestically, what did this do for Trump? Domestic
Well,
politics.
it got us talking about Jerusalem rather than the Mueller investigation,
Right.
which may be part of the point. I personally tend not to see the president's announcements either here or on anything or on most things as part of a grand strategy. I mean, it seems that his modus operandi is to stir up the pot. And it got him elected president, and I think it's working for. He believes that it's working for him. So I'm not even sure he actually cares deeply about the final disposition of Jerusalem. I think, based on what we've seen, his behavior in terms of the Paris Climate Accords, in terms of the Iran deal, I think he likes to see himself, present himself as a strong leader who makes decisions that his predecessors cowed away from. And my instinct is that's the lens through which he saw this decision. His predecessors made the waiver, but he's going to be the one to kind of say, you know what, I'm going to do what the American people have been asking for some time, regardless of the consequences.
Because one of the things he said was that, look, I made the promise, and other presidents have made the promise as well, but I actually carried out my promise.
At least rhetorically.
Right, rhetorically. Dan, domestically, Israel, how would the Israeli people be looking at this? Would Netanyahu's popularity increase, or would they take a second look at this and say, what have we got ourselves into?
I think a lot depends on what happens over the next few days and whether this will result in major violence or a third intifada, as some are promising, or this will just subside after a few days of rage, as your correspondent has reported on. It really depends on that. Because right now, again, it doesn't change reality on the ground, and many Israelis are going to wake up tomorrow. And despite the announcement, life is going to be much of the same in Jerusalem. It will remain the capital in the same way. It doesn't do anything on the ground. So I do think that a lot depends on how this would be played out in the coming days, and there's no way to tell at the moment. The reaction of the Arab world and Palestinians so far is harsh but constrained. And whether there will be spillovers or whether we'll be seeing greater violence is obviously going to impact how Israelis feel. I think that also there is consensus among the Israeli Jews, among Israeli Zionists, that this is a move that they welcome. Of course, Israeli Arabs are very unhappy about this, and some on the left are happy but cautious. You would characterize it that way. It certainly does take away from Netanyahu's investigations and other things that have been in the news lately. So again, time will tell.
Both these leaders seem to be in the same position, don't they? Omar, the threat of violence. The Palestinians have said there's going to be 3 days of rage. I mean, could we see another intifada start here?
I mean, I don't know if it would go as far as a full-fledged intifada. Yeah. Frankly, just the repression over the, Palestinians have had 2 intifadas. The first one, which was far less violent, practically non-violent, throwing rocks and that kind of thing was dominated by that. It ended up leading them to a peace process, to the possibility of statehood. The second intifada, which was armed, basically had devastating consequences for the Palestinians. It did not work out very well for them. So I'm hoping that there will be some level of strategic thinking in whatever. Frankly, the move does legitimize, it warrants a very strong reaction from Palestinians. I just hope that it is done in a way that is strategic. Nobody wants blind violence that leads to nothing good except for innocent people dying left and right. But at the end of the day, no matter how this works out, you cannot take the provocation away, the responsibility for it, from Trump. Whatever he wants to do to appease his base and rile them up, he also has to live with the consequences of his actions. So I think that this is what people have to keep their eyes on. It's the kind of thing where it's funny because Palestine as an issue in the entire Arab world had kind of dropped off their priority list between Yemen and Syria and everything. But I think this is the sort of thing that could actually coalesce the entire region around it again. It's a pretty sensitive issue. And
we have heard from some of the Arab states, but we don't have time for that. We're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.